Hello and welcome to Europe's Climate and Environment, a video podcast by the European Environment Agency, where we dig into the latest data, information on Europe's climate and environment.
If we take air quality, and this is probably one of the areas that's been regulated for the longest because we've been aware of air pollution for a long time. And we are making good progress there in terms of reducing the levels of air pollution in Europe and then the health effects that are associated with that. So, for example, we see that the number of premature deaths linked to air pollution has dropped by close to 50% over the last 20 years. Now, unfortunately, that means that we still have more than 200,000 premature deaths annually related to air pollution, but it's a lot better than it was, so we need to keep making progress in that area.
Welcome to the show. My name is Constant Brand. In our last special episode, we are talking about pollution and health, where we dig into what Europe's Environment 2025 report says about air pollution, noise pollution, or water pollution and chemicals, and the impacts on our environment and on our health. Joining me for this episode are Ian Marnain and Eulalia Peris. Welcome to our show. Eulalia, can you introduce yourself, please?
My name is Eulalia Peris. I work at the European Environment Agency, and I am an environmental noise expert.
Ian?
And my name is Ian Marnain, and I lead the pollution and health team here at the EEA in Copenhagen.
Great. Pollution, of course, is a big part of Europe's Environment 2025 report. So we're dedicating a whole episode to pollution. And I guess the first question would be, Eulalia, to you. Pollution continues to resonate with many people as a key environmental problem. Why do you think that is?
I think in recent years, people have gained awareness that pollution has detrimental impacts on health. I think before we used to think about environment and pollution, something that really affected animal species maybe, but really now people start to be aware that pollution impacts health and impacts our daily life. I think also there has been an increase on environmental consciousness. For instance, there are many people who think a little bit what they eat, so they can be a little bit more environmentally sustainable. For instance, there are people who choose to travel with trains over planes, also to be more environmentally sustainable. So I think these behaviors have increased in the past years, especially amongst young people. And this is really shown in many surveys about environment. Specifically, one that comes to mind is the Eurobarometer. They have found that 80% of Europeans are concerned about environment and health, and that they are also concerned about the harms of chemicals in their daily life products. So this really shows that people are conscious about the pollution problems that we have.
Okay, so let's break down what the report says on pollution. Of course, we focus on air, noise, water, and chemical pollution in the report. Ian, can you explain briefly the key findings in these areas? So basically, how are we doing to reduce the levels of pollution?
Yeah, and it's a little bit of a mixed story in this regard. And I think it's fair to say that we've made progress in some areas, maybe not so much in others, and that we certainly still have a lot of work to do. But just to go into a little bit of detail, if we take air quality, and this is probably one of the areas that's been regulated for the longest because we've been aware of air pollution for a long time. And we are making good progress there in terms of reducing the levels of air pollution in Europe and then the health effects that are associated with that. So, for example, we see that the number of premature deaths linked to air pollution has dropped by close to 50% over the last 20 years. Now, unfortunately, that means that we still have more than 200,000 premature deaths annually related to air pollution, but it's a lot better than it was. So we need to keep making progress in that area. If we think about noise, this is maybe an under-recognized area in terms of the impacts that it's having, and we see that it is very significant in terms of the impact that long-term exposure to noise has on health and well-being. And we're seeing very little progress in relation to that. So again, somewhere that we need to focus a little bit more. In water pollution, we see that bathing water, for example, bathing water quality is very good and has remained excellent across Europe. But we see issues, for example, with chemicals in drinking water, and probably people have heard of this PFAS, this forever chemical. And the more we look for it, the more we find it. And this is a significant issue. We also know that only 30% of the water bodies in Europe are meeting what we call good chemical status. And we see issues with runoff from agriculture, for example, which are also impacting on air quality and have an impact on the environment and on health as well. And then on chemicals, this is an area where we're starting to learn more and more. And we are measuring the levels of chemicals in people's bodies, and we're discovering that there's a very wide range of chemicals present, some above safe levels. So again, certainly something that we need to learn more about and do more on. So good progress in some areas, but certainly we need to keep maintaining progress towards achieving much lower impacts on health from environmental pollution.
Certainly, there's quite a lot to work on here on pollution levels. I guess on air pollution or noise and so forth, is the impact of these levels of pollution higher in cities rather than in rural areas, or?
Yeah, I mean, Eulalia can talk a little bit more about noise, but certainly from an air quality perspective, we see that things like transport, for example, are significant sources of pollution in some cities. Also, home heating, if people are using solid fuels as well, for example. So urban areas can be a significant source of air pollution, especially to multiple sources of pollution as well. So not just air pollution, but noise or other forms of pollution. So it's something that we need to address.
And of course, the report highlights as one of the good news stories is that air quality is improving.
Yes.
But people, as you said, are still dying prematurely.
Yes, people are dying prematurely, and certainly those numbers are high. But it's not just about the premature deaths. This also affects people's daily lives. If they're living with these illnesses like asthma, like diabetes, like cardiovascular disease, or if they've suffered a stroke that could be related to pollution. So it impacts on the quality of people's lives. So we often see that the number of deaths tend to be highlighted in the media and in the press, but really this is also having an impact on what people can do, whether they can enjoy outdoor activities, for example, if they have asthma, that they may need to stay indoors on certain days. That has a disproportionate effect on older people as well. So I think it's not just about the number of deaths, but also how it affects, and particularly those vulnerable groups like children or adults, where the impacts can be even greater.
And on noise pollution, I don't want to forget you, Eulalia. It's particularly underappreciated. I mean, a lot of people may not know much about noise pollution and how it impacts them. It's quite alarming and surprising in many areas. Yeah. Why do you think that it's so underappreciated?
I think there are several reasons for that. One reason is that people tend to associate noise pollution with damages in our auditory system. So, for instance, being next to a loud machine or a loud concert, and really the noise from it impacting your hearing system. Really, people many times don't realize that for instance, living in areas that are exposed to noise from road, railways, or airports. And really, these are levels that we are used to hear every day. This really can have other impacts on our health that are beyond our auditory system. For instance, living in areas that are exposed to levels of traffic noise, railway noise, airport noise have been associated with cardiovascular disease, metabolic disease, etc. So noise really is not an annoyance. And many people sometimes tell me, I live next to a road, but I sleep like a log. And I always say to them, you think you sleep like a log, but really what the studies showed is that your sleep is not so deep, that you have more unconscious awakenings, than your heartbeat, it's faster, etc., etc. So I think these are some of the reasons why there is not so much awareness that low levels of noise pollution that we are used to hear every day really impact our health.
Certainly, I mean, especially if you live in the suburbs or so forth, lawnmowers, dogs barking, parties, for instance, can also have an impact. But these are more short form noise bursts, I suppose, rather than what you're talking about. Does the data show that any particular noise element is worse than another one in transport, or?
Well, the most prevalent source of noise as regards to transport is road traffic noise, because the number of people really that live next to roads is much higher. Noise from railways or airports, it's equally important, but it's much more localized. So really what we see from our data is that many people live in areas that potentially pose a risk to health as regards to road traffic noise.
And for instance, what surprises me is the amount of noise coming from tires themselves. And for instance, also, of course, people are shifting to electric vehicles now, and they think they're doing something better for the environment. But what in terms of noise pollution difference does that make?
Well, electric cars are not going to solve the problem of noise pollution. First of all, because at higher speeds, the noise that dominates is the interaction between the tire and the asphalt. So any really speeds that are above 30 kilometers an hour, really the noise of the engine doesn't have any impact. So it comes from the interaction between the tire and the asphalt. Of course, if we would reduce the speed limits in cities, we could see a little improvement. But of course, we need to be aware also that there are all these enhancement noise systems, for example, for people who cannot see. So really, we don't see that the electric cars are going to bring a major improvement here. Also, because we see that cars now are much bigger. Have you seen the tires of an electric vehicle? They are huge compared to older cars. So this really brings much noise.
And also these tires are, just to add, take it a little bit differently, but the tires are also a significant source of microplastic release into the environment. So even, you mentioned the cars, these cars are also very heavy, so they're harder to slow down as well. So brake wear, tire wear are also significant sources of pollution. So for example, air pollution as well. So again, that we need a balance, that if we all switch to electric cars, it's not going to be the answer to the pollution issue as well.
But it's a broader question of congestion and shifting perhaps to more modal public transport, for instance.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's a balance between all of these things, yeah.
And while I have you on this, of course, we've just released our noise pollution report, which came just after the release of Europe's environment report as well. What are the key findings of that?
So the key findings, one key finding that I already mentioned is that many people are exposed to harmful levels of noise. We estimate that 30% of people live in areas where noise levels from road, rail, or aircraft can pose harmful impacts to health. We estimate that noise from transport contributes to about 66,000 premature deaths every year. We also estimate that noise pollution contributes to about 50,000 cases of cardiovascular diseases a year, and we also estimate that exposure to transport noise contributes to about 22,000 new cases of diabetes type 2 annually in Europe.
Okay, so some startling statistics there. So what's being done about it?
Well, much more needs to be done, because really over the past years we don't see a clear decreasing trend. We know that countries and cities are doing some actions to tackle noise pollution. However, they tend to be quite localized in very specific areas, or if broader areas are tackled, these measures can be counteracted with increasing transport demands, increasing use of car, of transport, also more population living in areas that are already affected by high transport levels. So really, maybe these measures are also being counteracted by these other factors. And also I want to say that, yes, in the European Union, there are some ambitions to reduce noise, but there is not a clear pathway on how to achieve this.
Okay. We'll get back to that further on what the EU is doing, but I want to get back to Ian here and perhaps shift a little bit gears into chemical pollution in particular. What sort of challenges do we face here, Ian?
Yeah, chemicals is a fairly pervasive challenge. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the things about chemicals is the more you look for them, the more you find them. And it's an issue that's been around for many, many years. I don't know if you've ever read the book Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, but this was written back in the early 1960s, and she was trying to highlight the impacts that pesticides, so chemical use in pesticides, actually has on the environment and on health and well-being, that while it kills all of the pests and perhaps increases the yields in our crops, it actually has a detrimental effect more broadly on an environment and health. And one of the main problems with chemicals is that we don't find out how harmful they are for many, many years. So if we think about one of the current chemicals that's really being highlighted is this PFAS, or when I say it's a group of chemicals, there's about 10,000 of these PFAS chemicals. So they've been used for many, many decades.
And such uses as?
Well, things like in cookware, non-stick pans, it's even used on things like, for example, on the inside of microwave popcorn bags. It gives that sort of non-stick approach. It also has been used in outdoor wear, so weatherproof clothing, etc. So keeping us dry as part of our outdoor activities. It's used and has been used in things like ski wax. So all of these uses mean that we find these PFAS chemicals in the environment, and they were invented many, many decades ago. But it's only in more recent times we actually discover that they have an impact on the environment and they have an impact on health. And one of the key issues with these and many other chemicals is that they're really, really highly persistent. So even when we stop using them, they're going to remain in the environment and they're going to remain in our bodies for many, many years. And a historical example of this is the use of mercury, which was very widespread in industrial uses and many other uses. And even now we see that the levels of mercury in fish that are caught in Europe and around the world are high. And for example, we have guidance now on how much tuna we should eat, because the levels of mercury in tuna can be a little bit elevated. So we need to balance the health benefits of eating fish and making sure that, for example, with certain species, that we control the intake on some of them. So what I think we need to achieve with chemicals is that we recognize much earlier when these chemicals pose a risk. And that's actually a role that the EEA will be involved in the coming years as well, because we can't wait 40, 50, 60 years or longer to discover that these chemicals are having significant impact, because it's never too late to do something about it. But the earlier we take the action, the more effective it can be. So we need to develop chemicals that are safer, that are more sustainable, and that don't impact on the environment and human health. Because it's not like we can stop chemical use altogether. Chemicals are an important part of our daily lives. They're part of everything that we do, but it's about finding a sustainable way of developing and using them.
Okay, I know the EA has been involved in what we call the European Biomonitoring Project.
Yes.
Which is now the new acronym PARC, but anyway.
Yes.
Basically, they're looking into the impact of chemicals on our bodies.
Yes, yeah, and one of the difficulties with chemicals is that we measure, for example, chemicals in soil, we measure chemicals in water. Other agencies like the European Food Safety Authority, they measure the levels of chemicals in food. But sometimes it's difficult from all of this data to actually work out, well, what does this mean for health?
Yeah.
So the idea with human biomonitoring is that we actually measure the levels of these chemicals in people's bodies. And that helps us to actually understand what the impacts are, because we measure the levels, And then we can also develop guideline values, for example, to understand if there's a potential risk to health and well-being. So this is a much more direct way of understanding the links between the chemicals in the environment, the impact on the levels in human bodies, and then the impact on health and well-being. And some countries are doing a lot of this human biomonitoring, and we're gathering more and more data on the levels of these chemicals. And actually, under this new regulation called the One Substance, One Assessment regulation, there will be an EU-wide survey. So we'll get data on chemicals in human bodies across Europe. And this will be a really rich source of data in terms of increasing our understanding of the links between chemicals in the environment and the impacts that they have on health and well-being. So we're quite excited about that and the power of this human biomonitoring data to really help us understand and quantify the impacts on health, because we have a lot of data and knowledge about the impacts of, for example, air pollution. We know how many people are dying each year. Eulalia gave us the figures on the number of people that are dying from noise pollution. We know for individual chemicals, for example, that they have a significant impact, things like lead. We know that lead still poses a risk to health. But more broadly, when we think about the thousands of chemicals that are present in the environment, we haven't fully quantified it. So that's something that we need to do in the coming years.
So then this data would then feed into reports and analysis that hopefully leads to looking at new policies or revising rules.
Yeah. And I think, just to be clear, the evidence is there to act, because we know, even with the limited amount of human biomonitoring we've done now, we know that there are certain chemicals, like we published a briefing in the last couple of years on this chemical called bisphenol A, which is present in, for example, or has been present in food packaging. It's banned now, but we know that the levels of this that are present in people's bodies across the entirety of Europe are actually at levels that are harmful to health. So this is a really clear finding that has come out of this human biomonitoring study, that this chemical is present at harmful levels. And it's been replaced by another chemical called bisphenol S. But unfortunately, this is what we call a regrettable substitution, where we see that one chemical was replaced by a different chemical, but it turns out it has equally harmful impacts. So again, we need to avoid these kind of patterns as well, and develop these much safer chemicals in the first place.
Okay. Eulalia, if I can ask you, what are the key hurdles to reducing pollution overall?
For noise pollution, for example, one of the key hurdles is what I mentioned before, which is increase of demand in transport use, for instance, also increase of the number of people that live in areas that are affected by noise, but also one of the maybe stoppers, it's that we don't have really in the noise legislation any kind of pathway to reduce noise pollution. We don't have any limits. So really we've seen that work for other pollutants. We were speaking before about air pollution. So we've seen that really with clear and strong policy, the main air pollutants have decreased over the years. Unfortunately for noise, we don't have yet this kind of policy where there are incentives to reduce noise pollution. We have a legislation that requires countries to report the number of people that are exposed to harmful noise levels, but there is no obligation to take action or to really decrease the noise levels.
I think, from my perspective, I think if we take a step back from this, I think that one of the key things for me is that we also need to take a more integrated approach to how we look at pollution. It's clear from other work that we do at the EEA that our consumption levels are too high. And if we're consuming stuff and we're making products and we're disposing of products and we're using them, there's pollution associated with all of the stages of the life cycle of these products. And over the last decade, we have really not been able to reduce what we call our our consumption footprint. So if we think about when we make something, we may have to mine raw materials from the ground. That's pollution associated with that. During the manufacturing process, and then we're using these products in our homes, which may be a source of pollution, and then we have to dispose of them. So our consumption levels are too high.
And as far as I don't want to interrupt, but
Yeah.
it would be amiss if we didn't mention plastic pollution here.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the amount of plastic that we're using continues to increase. People are much more aware of maybe not wanting to drink as much from plastic bottles because they're aware of microplastics. And one of the issues here is that as well that obviously we need to recycle more plastic. But in some cases, it's actually more expensive to recycle plastic than to produce plastic from virgin materials. So we need to come up with ways where we can have a more circular economy as well, so that we don't have this linear approach that we make stuff, we use it, and then we dispose of it and we start again. But we need to put some of these materials back into the process in a economically viable way as well, because at the moment it's clear that we're living beyond the means of the planet, and people maybe haven't always made that link that what we do and the way that we live our lives, the way we travel, the way we eat, this sort of consumption society that we're in perhaps promotes and increases pollution. And if we really want to do that, I think if we want to be more sustainable, then we probably need to manage our consumption in a different way.
Mm-hmm. Perhaps getting back to more pollution-wise, what specifically has the EU done on pollution to reduce pollution? You mentioned, the Human Biomonitoring Project. Can you mention some other areas?
Yeah, specifically in relation to pollution, we have the EU has developed a what's called a Zero Pollution Action Plan, which first of all sets out for 2030 some specific targets that we need to achieve in relation to different areas of pollution, for example, on air pollution, noise pollution, water, waste, looking at, for example, nutrients from agriculture, which is a significant source of pollution that affects water. So it sets interim targets for 2030 to reduce the levels of pollution from a wide range of sources. And then the long-term ambition is that by 2050 we would get to levels of pollution which are no longer harmful to the environment and human health. So these kind of policies help to keep our focus on how we're doing. And the EEA and working with other EU agencies and working with the Commission as well is assessing how we're doing in terms of achieving these targets. As we've already mentioned, we're making progress on air pollution. We are not doing so well on noise pollution. In water pollution, we also have other initiatives as well. For example, there's more of a focus on this concept of One Health. And this is where we need to take a more integrated approach, for example, to dealing with things like noise pollution, air pollution, and looking at where we can come up with win-win approaches. If we look at urban areas, we can come up with solutions that actually reduce air pollution, reduce noise pollution, increase the amount of green space that we have in our urban areas. And so it gives people areas, for example, to enjoy outdoor time. So we need these more sort of integrated approaches to addressing pollution as well. So there is a lot going on, and we have a lot of strong legislation in Europe. So one of the key things is also around making sure that we fully implement that so that we can deliver on the expected reductions in pollution that are envisaged through this legislation.
Of course, just to get back to the Zero Pollution Initiative, how realistic is it that we get to zero pollution? People might ask, zero pollution, is that even possible?
Yeah, it's not the first time I've heard that response, and I think zero pollution in itself, obviously it's a very lofty ambition, but I think it's possible to get to levels of pollution where the impact is not significant. We know that when we look at air pollution, there are parts of Europe that are meeting the World Health Organization air quality limits. There's not many, but there are some, so it's possible, but obviously it needs some fairly transformative action to address. So I think if we set the bar up here, then if we achieve very close to that, I think it will be a huge improvement of where we are now at this point in time.
And I think another big issue that the report highlights is vulnerable groups that might be left behind. So a just transition. How does that play into levels of pollution across Europe?
Yeah, I mean, inequalities is really a significant issue, and people, for example, who are vulnerable people, like the people who are already ill, or who the elderly or children, there is a lot of evidence that they tend to be disproportionately impacted by air pollution, for example. And this is because that there's higher levels of exposure, and then this leads to higher levels of impact as well. So we have an indicator at the EEA looking at the difference in exposure to air pollution between the wealthiest and the poorest groups in Europe. And we see that there's a consistent and significant difference between the exposure and also the impact between those groups as well. And I think this is a fairly critical societal issue, that we're not closing the gap in impact between the richest and the poorest. And we also need to protect the most vulnerable, for example, because we see that it's not just that they're exposed to air pollution, they're also, for example, nowadays more risk of exposure to extreme heat during the summer or extreme cold in the winter. And these in combination can have an even more significant impact. We know that, for example, people that already suffer from cardiovascular disease, extreme heat during the summer means that they're more likely to be admitted to hospital. There's an increasing risk of stroke, for example, in these situations as well. So it's about the combination of impacts as well. So it's important that we particularly protect those more vulnerable groups. And also with children, I know that Eulalie has been looking at the impacts of noise exposure on children, and there's a disproportionate impact there.
Yeah, so just a note on noise about inequalities, vulnerable groups, etc. For instance, what we see is that people who are more socially disadvantaged have less means to protect themselves from noise. For instance, less economic resources for building insulation, for double glazed windows, etc., etc. For noise, we're also now in the studies, we're starting to see that some specific groups, for instance, with specific pre-existing health conditions, can be more affected by exposure to noise from transport. And the issue of children, this has been already been studied for a while. So it's not only adults really that suffer from noise pollution, but children, they're also impacted first because children also live in areas that are exposed to high levels of road, railway, or aircraft, but children also go to schools that can be close to roads, railways, or airports. And this has been shown to have an effect in the learning of children, for instance.
Great. Thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So this is part of the show when we ask our experts to share a little insight. So what inspires them? What drives them to work in the area that you're working in? Eulalie, you want to start?
I think one thing that got me into working in noise pollution is that it's a very interdisciplinary area. It touches things about health, transport, urban planning, etc. So I really like this a lot. But on the other hand, I'm really, really sensitive to noise.
Really?
So I have to say I hate noise. I want to make a better world in the sense of reducing noise pollution also as a personal perspective.
Well, that can help all of us. Ian, what about yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I've been working on air pollution and the impacts on health for a long time. And for me, I think one of the important things that I realized quite early is that when you think about the impacts on health, you know, there are many people, for example, that you may have genetic health issues that you have health problems with, but everything that we're talking about now is preventable. So the impacts that air pollution or water pollution or noise pollution has on health and well-being, these are preventable. So I suppose it's nice to think that we could make a difference through some of these measures that we can recommend or suggest. And also for me, I think I agree with you. It's science, but it also links quite strongly to people as well. And over the last number of years, we've seen that people are listening more and more to what we have to say. So I think that's quite motivating as well to see that, as you said at the very start, that we're what we say is resonating with people.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.